Megan Hartley was the town's beloved schoolteacher. Roy Tanner, the respected detective everyone trusted. And when Megan vanished, it was Roy's name that surfaced in whispers no one dared speak aloud. In the summer of 2003, Riverton was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace. The town stretched along tree-lined streets, with tidy lawns and porches where neighbors sat to watch children race bikes down the pavement. It had the air of safety, the type of quiet where every face was familiar and every stranger stood out. That summer, though, the illusion began to crack, and it started with the sudden disappearance of a young woman whose life seemed ordinary, steady, and safe. Her name was Megan Hartley, a 27-year-old schoolteacher who had lived in Riverton nearly her whole life. People remembered her as the teacher who stayed late after class, helping children who struggled, the one who donated her weekends to school plays and tutoring. She lived alone in a modest rental house not far from the elementary school, drove a red sedan that was almost always parked in the same driveway, and seemed like the least likely person to vanish without a trace. On June 12th, she left the school parking lot at the end of the day, carrying her usual canvas bag of papers to grade. A coworker saw her pull out into the road, sunlight glinting off the windshield as she waved, and that was the last time anyone in Riverton saw her alive. The following morning, when she failed to show up for work, her colleagues were unsettled. Megan was not the type to skip school without notice. She prided herself on consistency, and for her to vanish overnight seemed unthinkable. A call to her home went unanswered, and by the end of the day, worry spread quickly. It wasn't long before her family became involved, and soon after that, the police. Her car was discovered that evening on a quiet stretch of road on the outskirts of town. The sedan was locked but not abandoned in the usual sense. The keys were still in the ignition, her purse sat neatly on the passenger seat, and the doors showed no signs of tampering. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no evidence of a struggle, only the eerie silence of an ordinary car parked where it did not belong. For those who knew Megan, the scene felt staged, almost too carefully arranged. At first there was hope that she might return, perhaps shaken by something personal, perhaps hiding for reasons no one yet understood. But that hope quickly dimmed. The more people looked, the less sense it made. Megan's bank accounts remained untouched, her cell phone went dead the night she vanished, and there were no sightings, no calls, nothing at all. The stillness of her absence pressed down on the town, filling everyday conversations with dread. When the police gave their first official statement, their tone startled everyone. They claimed there was no evidence of foul play, that Megan might have left voluntarily, and that there was no reason for the community to panic. For her family, the words felt like a betrayal. They knew her routines, her character, and above all her devotion to her students. To suggest she had chosen to walk away seemed impossible, yet the officers maintained their calm assurance, as if eager to move the matter aside. For Riverton, the message was clear. Something was wrong, not only with Megan's disappearance, but with how the very people entrusted to find her seemed strangely unwilling to look. And beneath the surface of quiet suburban streets, a darker suspicion began to grow, one that would haunt the town for years to come. As days turned into weeks, the unease in Riverton grew heavier. Megan's name slowly slipped from newspaper headlines, her photograph began to yellow on missing person posters taped to shop windows, and the urgency of the case seemed to dissolve into silence. People whispered in grocery store aisles and on church steps, but the official updates dwindled until they were almost non-existent. Each press release sounded rehearsed, as if written more to reassure than to reveal. To many it seemed as though the town's protectors wanted her disappearance to fade quietly, rather than be solved. Her brother Matthew Hartley refused to accept the indifference. He began piecing together his own timeline, scribbling notes late at night in a cluttered notebook. He collected every detail he could find, her co-workers' recollections, the unanswered calls on her phone records, even the direction her car had been spotted traveling just before it was found abandoned. It didn't take long before he noticed something troubling. The official version of events released by police left out crucial hours. Megan was said to have left school around 4 p.m., yet no report accounted for her movements until nearly 7 p.m., when her car was supposedly last seen near the outskirts of town. Where she was during those missing hours remained unexplained. Matthew pressed harder. Conversations with co-workers revealed that Megan had seemed unusually tense in the days before she vanished. She had told one colleague she felt uncomfortable around a police officer who frequently visited the school. The visits, explained as routine safety checks, seemed to happen more often than necessary, and always when Megan was present. The officer, Detective Roy Tanner, was well known in Riverton, On the surface, he was everything people expected from law enforcement: polite, quick with a smile, always visible at community events. Yet beneath that polished exterior, there were stories of nights spent drinking too heavily, sudden eruptions of temper, and close ties with people better avoided. When Matthew tried to share his concerns, he met resistance at every turn. The department brushed off his questions, dismissed his worries, and labeled his suspicions as grief clouding his judgment. But the deeper he dug, the stranger the case became. Witness statements seemed to vanish from the record. A neighbor who claimed to see Megan's car parked near Tanner's house on the night she disappeared was never contacted again. Phone logs that should have been straightforward were said to be incomplete. Even Megan's own informal complaint about feeling harassed, which she had written just days before she went missing, could not be located. The gaps became too glaring to ignore. It wasn't just that the case lacked answers, it was as though someone was deliberately erasing them. Whenever Matthew pressed harder, doors closed. Officers once friendly turned cold. The local paper stopped covering the story, citing lack of developments, though Matthew suspected pressure had been applied to silence reporters. Every avenue that should have brought him closer to truth instead seemed to bend back toward silence. As frustration grew, so did a dangerous realization. Megan hadn't simply vanished into thin air, and the reason no progress was being made wasn't incompetence. It was intention. Someone with influence wanted her story buried, and the longer Matthew searched, the clearer it became that the very institution meant to protect Riverton might be at the center of the darkness surrounding her disappearance. 2 years after Megan's disappearance, Riverton had settled into an uncomfortable rhythm of silence. Her name was spoken less often, her face no longer appeared on the nightly news, and many in town acted as though the case was nothing more than an unsolved riddle destined to fade into history. But that illusion was shattered on an ordinary spring morning in 2005, when a construction crew began work on the riverbank just outside town. They were preparing the ground for a new walking path when a shovel struck something solid, something that did not belong. Within hours, the worksite transformed into a crime scene, and the town's old wound was torn open once again. Buried in a shallow grave wrapped tightly in a deteriorating tarp were human remains. The sight was grim, but investigators quickly suspected the identity even before forensic confirmation. When the tests came back, their fears were confirmed. The remains were those of Megan Hartley. For Riverton, the discovery reignited grief and horror, but it also raised a much darker question. Why had her case been allowed to grow so cold when the truth was hidden so close to town all along? The condition of Megan's body revealed what her family had feared since the day she vanished. She had not walked away, she had not started a new life, she had not chosen to leave. Her skull bore the unmistakable fractures of blunt force trauma, evidence of a violent blow to the head. Marks on her wrists showed she had been restrained, bound tightly with something that cut into the skin. Even after 2 years, the evidence spoke clearly of suffering, of control, of cruelty in her final moments. But one detail chilled investigators more than anything else. Clamped to her wrist was a single rusting handcuff, not a common brand, not one you would find in an ordinary home, but a police-issued model used by officers across the state. The discovery turned speculation into something far more dangerous. It suggested Megan's killer was not an unknown drifter or some faceless predator. It suggested the murderer was someone with authority, someone sworn to protect. News of the handcuffs spread quickly through the community. People who had once accepted the official story now questioned every statement they had been told. Rumors of a cover-up became louder, more insistent. Families who had once trusted the Riverton police began locking their doors at night and wondering how many other secrets were being kept from them. For Megan's brother, the handcuff was the proof he had been waiting for. Confirmation that his suspicions about Detective Roy Tanner were not only justified but terrifyingly accurate. Yet even with the remains uncovered, there was hesitation. Riverton police seemed reluctant to investigate one of their own. Questions were dodged, records were delayed, and the focus shifted again and again away from Tanner, as if the department hoped the story would somehow lose momentum. But the truth could no longer be contained. The shallow grave had given Megan a voice, one that spoke louder than any denial or dismissal. For Riverton, the horror was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about the possibility that the killer had worn a badge, walked their streets, and shaken their hands while hiding the most monstrous of secrets. The discovery of Megan's remains forced state investigators to step in, stripping the Riverton Police Department of control over the case. For many, this moment felt like long-awaited justice, but what emerged in the months that followed was far more disturbing than anyone imagined. Files once thought misplaced began to surface. Timelines that had been glossed over were scrutinized, and suddenly the image of a respected detective in Riverton began to fracture. At the center of it all stood Detective Roy Tanner, a man whose polished public reputation had hidden an undercurrent of corruption and violence. When investigators reviewed his logs from the night Megan disappeared, they found glaring inconsistencies. Tanner claimed he had been conducting routine patrols across town, yet GPS records from his patrol car painted another story. His vehicle had idled for nearly 40 minutes at a secluded spot near the riverbank, the very place where Megan's body was eventually uncovered. His excuse that he had pulled over to complete paperwork sounded thin, especially given the time gap and the silence in his radio activity during those crucial hours. Digging deeper, investigators discovered that Megan had filed an informal complaint about Tanner in the days before she vanished. She had written that his visits to her school were making her uncomfortable, that he lingered too long in her classroom, and that she felt watched whenever he was near. She told a colleague she intended to file something more formal soon, but she never got the chance. That complaint should have been logged and reviewed by the department, yet it had been deliberately withheld. The document resurfaced only after state investigators pried open records that local police had conveniently ignored. The picture of Tanner's private life also came into sharper focus. He was not just an officer with a temper, he was a man with deep connections to Riverton's underbelly. Investigators uncovered financial links between Tanner and a local bar owner long rumored to be involved in drug trafficking. Large unexplained deposits had appeared in Tanner's accounts, and witnesses came forward quietly to say they had seen him accepting cash envelopes in back rooms. It became clear that Tanner was providing protection, turning a blind eye to illegal activity in exchange for money. Megan had stumbled onto these dealings without realizing how dangerous they were. A student had overheard Tanner speaking on his phone about shipments and had repeated it in class. Megan, always protective of her students, confided in a coworker that she suspected something was wrong. She planned to report it properly, perhaps believing her position as a teacher would shield her. Instead, it marked her for silencing. The deeper the investigation went, the worse it became for Riverton's police force as a whole. It was not just Tanner acting alone. Several officers had looked the other way, had failed to follow up on leads, and had buried evidence that might have exposed the truth earlier. Some did so out of loyalty, others out of fear, and some, perhaps, because they too were compromised. The institution that had once stood as Riverton's shield had been corroded from within. For the town, these revelations were devastating. To know that Megan's murderer had not only worn a badge but had been protected by the very system meant to stop him shattered trust entirely. Every unanswered call, every missing record, every dismissive press statement was no longer seen as incompetence. It was proof of complicity. The corruption at the heart of Riverton's police force had allowed a young woman's life to be taken and hidden, and it had taken years for the truth to claw its way into the light. In 2007, after years of silence and obstruction, Roy Tanner was finally arrested and charged with the murder of Megan Hartley. The trial that followed was not only about a single act of violence, but about the shadow it cast over an entire town. As prosecutors laid out their case, the courtroom became a window into the corruption that had poisoned Riverton's police department. Piece by piece, the story unfolded, and each detail revealed how close Megan's killer had come to escaping justice altogether. The prosecution presented Tanner as a man who abused the power of his badge to hide his crimes. They showed the falsified patrol logs, the missing complaint filed by Megan, and the GPS data that placed him at the exact site where her body was discovered. The handcuff clamped to her wrist was brought into the courtroom as the most damning piece of evidence, a silent reminder that her killer had not been a stranger lurking in the dark, but someone she should have been able to trust. Witnesses testified about his reputation, about the temper he tried to mask, and about the way the department had worked to shield him. Megan's brother sat through every day of testimony, hearing for the first time how far the cover-up had gone. It became clear that officers had ignored witnesses who placed Tanner near Megan's car on the night she vanished. They had delayed the release of her phone records and had quietly pushed aside the complaint she filed about his harassment. Even after her body was found, there had been hesitation, a reluctance to point fingers at one of their own. The jury listened as these failures were recounted, and what emerged was not simply a portrait of a killer, but of a system that had enabled him. Tanner's defense team tried to paint him as a scapegoat, a convenient target for public anger. They argued that evidence had been mishandled, that other suspects had not been fully investigated, but the weight of the evidence crushed those arguments. Too many pieces led back to him, and the coincidences stacked up until they were impossible to dismiss. When the verdict was finally read, guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and grief. Megan's family wept quietly, not in triumph but in exhaustion, knowing it had taken years of struggle to reach that moment. Tanner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet even with him behind bars, the outcome felt hollow to many. The officers who had helped bury Megan's case resigned quietly, facing no real punishment. The department itself issued vague apologies, speaking of mistakes rather than deliberate choices. Riverton was left with the unsettling knowledge that justice had only come because outsiders had stepped in, and that if not for chance, the discovery of her body at the riverbank, Megan's case might have remained buried forever. In the years since, Megan's story has lingered like a scar on the town. It became a cautionary tale, told not only as the tragedy of a young woman's life cut short, but as a warning of what happens when institutions place loyalty above truth. People still leave flowers near the riverbank where she was found, a quiet act of remembrance for the woman whose death exposed the darkness behind Riverton's polished image. And while her killer now spends his life behind bars, the chilling truth remains that her murder was nearly erased, not by chance but by design.